And God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. That is a theme that pervades the letters to the people in Corinth. He writes it one way in the first letter to Corinthians, and he writes it another way in the excerpt we heard this morning from 2 Corinthians, that we boast in God through our weaknesses, for that is how we grow the power of God in ourselves. That is a very strange idea, isn't it? And Paul tells a very strange little story this morning, doesn't he? I know someone who is carried to the third heaven, he says. And it's a little more strange because he doesn't even say that was me. It reminds me of an episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza keeps going, George is angry, George is hungry. Because it's a little strange when people talk about themselves in the third person, isn't it? But that's what he's doing, describing his conversion experience that we're far more familiar with from the book of Acts. When he is struck down off his horse, blinded by lights on the road to Damascus, and spends 3 days in what he calls a third heaven, a paradise, blind. But after those 3 days, he goes from Saul, persecutors of people who follow Jesus, to Paul, someone who risks his own life to say, we are all forgiven. We are all chosen ones. And our power lies in accepting and living this message of whole and holy dependence. If you read prior to the excerpt we heard this morning in chapters 10 and 11 of this letter, he makes an impassioned plea. You can hear him yelling in that letter. He talks about his divine jealousy for the people in his church in Corinth. He talks about how he took money from other congregations to put it in their stewardship campaign because he loved them so much. And he is beside himself because he believes they are being led astray with false teachings. While he's been away, some people have come forward that he calls super apostles. And they seem to be taking over. And they seem to be a lot cooler and slicker than Paul is. Apparently they are better looking. They're more articulate. And they are promising something that sounds a lot more appealing. A lot more appealing than the idea of we proclaim Christ crucified. That God's strength is somehow revealed in and through that weakness. But that's not surprising, right? I mean, none of us really want to boast about our weakness. I don't remember there being a big bunch of disciples down at the foot of that cross, right? They all ran away. Weakness is terrifying. Not something we boast about. Where's the good news in that? Well, maybe for some of us this morning, there is some good news in hearing that even with these famous figures of our faith, like Paul, like Jesus even, none of us get everything we want. No matter how many times we ask God for it, and no matter how good we are. Paul prays and prays for that thorn in his side to be taken away, but it won't go. Any of you have a thorn in your side this morning? A situation you would rather not be dealing with? A cloud looming over your head? A malady, an ailment? A person that you really wish would see things your way? Or maybe just go away? I think Paul is trying to convey that he is learning and growing in accepting this awareness that it is through these struggles that we come to accept and see God's grace in our lives. That these are opportunities for us to always be practicing and looking for where God is. And I think the reason he's so angry at these super apostles is that they are using his weakness, his thorn, as a sign of God's disfavor, pointing it out to people and saying, look at that. If he really was who he claimed to be, God would fix that and God would take that away. Paul would look the part. God does not see as humans see. As we heard long ago in that story with King David, long before he was the king we heard about this morning, we hear him say to that little shepherd boy, God observed strength and weakness very differently when he confronted Goliath on that mountain, right? Where you and I see weakness, God sees strength. Grace is sufficient, he gets as a reply to his prayers. My grace is sufficient for you. Somehow there is strength in acknowledging that God is with us, whatever it is we are going through. And somehow there's a strength in acknowledging how dependent we are on that grace just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. That strength leads to wisdom that is wiser than we can come to by ourselves. And to some, it may seem foolish, but to others, it does seem wise. Grace is really just acceptance. Grace is the only thing that Jesus gives those disciples when he sends them out 2 by 2. Just after all the people in Jesus' hometown make clear they don't think he's a super apostle either. Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, among their own kin, and in their own house. Jesus is amazed. He's only amazed twice in all the Gospels. Jesus is amazed at their unbelief. It's very human. He's amazed that he is ignored and treated the same way every prophet was before him. I'm sure that was a thorn in his side, but still God was at work. Some do believe. Some come to him. Some are cured. And apparently that is good enough. I find it kind of amazing that the writer would even put this story in the Gospels, talking about Jesus' failings. I think the writer, like all of us, would prefer a super prophet action hero, Jesus. You can find a lot of super prophet action hero Jesuses on the internet and get them from Amazon if you'd like one. They talk about all of Jesus' superpowers. And I read yesterday that 7 of the 11 top-grossing films of last year were all superhero movies. And that genre of film is getting bigger and bigger and bigger because it makes a whole lot of money. And there's a reason, right? There's a reason we love those stories. I like them. I watch them. They are seen by hundreds of millions of people, those superhero stories. And in those stories, strength and power are individualistic and very elevated. And that line between good and evil is comically clear. But that's the difference, right, between action movies and our real life. People aren't all good or all evil. People are complicated, our lives are gray, and there are not clear lines to always help us distinguish. And certainly, those movies don't resonate with Paul's wisdom about human strength and power. So if maybe you want to see a grace-filled blockbuster, because I'm certainly it won't break any movie studio's bank, please go see the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Yes. Which I'm sure, as you know, is the story of Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, and his ministry, a total ministry, for 30 years. I knew he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. I knew that, but I had no idea what a calling and vocation that work was for him. And it's so simple. Let the little children come to me, Jesus says. 30 years, over 30 years of simply treating children with dignity, validation, respect, kindness, attentiveness, helping them become aware of who they are and discover the wonder of the world around them. And every show sharing the nuggets, the mustard seed of the gospel. You are a child of God. You are beloved. That is enough. It was amazing rewatching, because I watched those as a child, and seeing how he took such time. There was so much quietness. Feed the fish. He would have loved ringing the bell. Maybe that's who inspired me to do it. And he just taught children it was okay to ask questions about things that were difficult. His make-believe world wasn't filled with superheroes. His make-believe world let kids say, am I a mistake? Am I okay? Am I wired right? His make-believe world let kids say, why are my parents getting divorced? What does divorce mean? His make-believe world let kids be aware that some of the things they heard in the news, like a president being assassinated, that they could ask a question. An adult would talk to them about what that scary, terrifying word was about. And watching him speak at a congressional hearing, which was this close to defunding all of public television, watching him speak, shaking, he was scared. He just shares who he is and his philosophy, his theology, that if we want a society of healthy, civil, kind adults, don't we need a place for our kids to be treated that way? Don't we need them to take in adults being kind and civil with them? Cultivating patience, cultivating awareness. And he says to the person who's leading the hearing, can I just sing you this song? And the guy's like, okay. And you really get the sense that the guy is kind of letting him talk, but he's already made up his mind. And so Mr. Rogers sings this song, what do you do with the mad that you feel? What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong and nothing you do seems right. Do you punch? Do you pound? Do you run? Do you hit with your fists? Or do you stop? Think about what you planned and say, maybe that's wrong. I'm going to do something else instead. Because there is something deep inside that will help you make that choice. There is that power, that wisdom, that grace already within you that will help you choose the kindness instead. That, I think, is what Paul is talking about, what he talks about in so many of his letters. Choosing patience and love not insisting on its own way, not being arrogant or boastful or rude, never rejoicing in wrongdoing, but always intended to build one another up. And from that very first question he asks at the beginning of the show, not Paul, but Mr. Rogers, won't you be my neighbor? Guess where he got that from? To all the ways he taught. He just demonstrates how it's in the smallest acts and words of kindness that we see the power of good always prevail. And you know, this thing happens at the end of the film, because at the end of his life was when 9/11 happened. And somebody in the local station who worked with the show said, we have to have him say something to the children to help them understand what's happening. And he's so overwhelmed, as all of us were, with what was going on. And it just reminded me, as I grow in my knowledge of different faith figures from our Bible and outside of the Bible, almost every single one to a T, as they near the end of their life ministry, as they near the end, they realize the limits of their strength, the limits of their wisdom, the reality that they will never be able to accomplish all they want to, and the world will not be what they want it to be. And through that, they still have hope. And they know that God will still be at work. And they know that whatever ways God used them, that will continue to be used in the world. And so he tells the children in a simple message that I see reverberated all the time, always look for the helpers. When something scary or hard has happened, just always look for the people who are the helpers. Always look for the good. Faith is simply a radical upending of superpower and superhero ideals. Small acts, small pairs, Jesus sends them out 2 by 2. And he says, just show up, just share a message of peace. And if they're not ready to hear it, and if they don't want to hear it, just move on. Don't worry, God's at work somehow in all of that. So I just close with our prayer. Our collect this morning, I think, just sums it up. God, you have taught us to keep every single commandment simply by loving God and loving our neighbor. So just give us grace to devote our whole heart to that work. Help us see the strength in our weaknesses and the foolish wisdom in the power of living that love. Amen. Please stand and join with me in affirming our faith in the Nicene Creed.